The Samurai Shodown series has always been blessed with being, in my opinion, more balanced than it seems. Even in the most broken of entries, the high-risk, high-reward nature of the gameplay helps to swing even the most lopsided of matchups. SamSho 2019 is no exception to this. With that said, some characters are still much better than others. Sometimes there are characters that are heavily reliant on fundamentals and the system mechanics to perform well with because they lack one or several things. Other times, characters are so focused on a gimmick that they fall apart completely once they're figured out. Today I wanted to go over who I think are the worst characters in Samurai Shodown 2019. These characters were selected through a mixture of multiple top player tier lists, as well as my own opinion. Wu, Kyoshiro, Basara, Earthquake, and Wanfu. A few of the picks may seem controversial to some, and that's okay. Discussion should always be encouraged.
But also I'm 100% correct and you're wrong.
Now, I want to make this clear. The fact that I'm calling these characters the worst doesn't mean they're unplayable. Samurai Shodown is a game heavily based around comebacks and use of the system mechanics. There are great players who have and still make these characters work. On top of that, these characters do have genuinely great parts about their kits that allow them to at least somewhat keep up with the rest of the cast. They're just going to be working much harder. If you're interested in picking any of these characters up, my goal here isn't to discourage you. My goal is to simply explain why these characters are often seen as low tier, but I will be highlighting their advantages as well. With that out of the way, let's get started. One of the newcomers in SamSho 2019, Wu Risheng is a set play zoner that specializes in space control and setups for potential high damage punishes. She has a fantastic traditional fireball that can hit mid, low, or higher up to catch jumpers. She also has a ground trap for extra zoning, and this is where her damage is mainly going to come from. If you're thinking about jumping, think twice because Wu also has some solid anti-airs to protect herself with, like her 2B and 2-2A. Wu's ground trap can lead to some pretty dirty mix-ups on block, and she even has some unblockable setups that can combo into her weapon flip, SSM, and E-set, the latter two being a rarity in this game. It's entirely possible for Wu to win a round off one interaction if she has the resources for it. So why is she often called the worst character in the game? Well, to start with, Wu is just kind of slow. When her traps work, they work pretty well. But her fireballs and traps also come with a lot of recovery, making it often difficult for her to actually begin her set play against someone that knows how to shut it down. This on its own wouldn't be so bad. If Wu had some solid enough normals, she'd be able to hold her own until she's able to start her set play. Unfortunately, her normals are pretty trash. Slow startup, slow recovery, and outside of a few normals, she's pretty stubby too. It's not unreasonable to say that she has the worst set of normals in the entire game. While she does cover jump-ins pretty well, she gets outpoked easily both on the ground and in the air. This puts Wu in an extra awkward position of constantly having to outplay the opponent in order to even start her game. It's not impossible. After all, your opponent is human and bound to make mistakes. But the very small wiggle room Wu has to work with in order to gain the upper hand is very noticeable. And in the scenario where Wu loses her weapon, she loses access to all of her specials, and is as helpless as she looks here. Better start getting good at stance breaks and weapon catches because if you don't, the round is likely over at that point. Wu is a character that requires a lot of precision and strategy to perform well with, making her arguably one of the hardest characters in the game to pick up, and perhaps one of the most satisfying characters to play when things go right. Series mainstay Kyoshiro is a defensive zoner with the typical tools you'd expect. He has long pokes, a grounded fireball, a DP that hits both sides of him, and he also has some safe on block specials. Great for annoying the opponent and getting some chip damage in. He also has a decently ranged command grab for some cheeky, albeit pretty fake, mix-ups. The extra options he has does make him a bit more well-rounded when compared to the other characters I'm talking about in this video. Unfortunately, while he isn't as restricted to a certain playstyle like the other characters here, Kyoshiro is held back by some very big flaws. To start with, let's look at his fireball. Fireballs are already pretty limited in SamSho 2019 due to the existence of Just Defense, but Kyoshiro's Fireball is pretty mediocre even by the game standards. Despite its appearance, this Fireball doesn't hit low, and the recovery on it is pretty slow. In fact, many of Kyoshiro's moves suffer from having slow recovery. His Toad Command Grab on whiff is about 90 frames of recovery, making it a free SSM punish for literally everyone in the cast. His heavy DP suffers this as well since it's around -92 on block. DPs are already extremely punishable, but Kyoshiro's DP is so slow that good reactions aren't even required to punish it. Kyoshiro's jump arc is terrible. Super slow and no safe way to shorten the jump. It's not unreasonable to say Kyoshiro should stay on the ground as much as he can. He's not the only character with this problem. It just means he needs to stay dominant on the ground. But Kyoshiro isn't actually as good at this as you might think. Many of his pokes are extra negative on hit, so while they aren't negative enough to the point where Kyoshiro can be punished most of the time, it makes it harder for him to keep the opponent away without scoring a knockdown. And there's another part of Kyoshiro's kit that I think is so terrible, it actually makes me angry that it was thought to be a good idea. I am referring to this. For those that don't understand, allow me to explain why I hate this move so much. One of the defining traits of a zoner is screen control. Holding down one position and limiting how your opponent is able to approach is a huge part of that. This crouch walk means that Kyoshiro can never completely hold a position on screen, making his zoning weaker than his contemporaries by default. It goes in direct conflict with his game plan, and even if the rest of his kit were strong, his role as a zoner would still be crippled due to this crouch walk. He's able to low profile some attacks with his crouch walk, which is kind of nice, but this niche upside doesn't make up for the huge disadvantages it brings. Kyoshiro's limited zoning makes it so he's unable to fully shut down any character with decent rushdown. For some characters, brute forcing your way into Kyoshiro's face is a legitimate strategy, and any gimmicks he may have to help stop this are either too slow or too punishable to be reliable. As he is, Kyoshiro is a character that has a little bit of everything. Unfortunately, it just so happens that everything he has is, for the most part, mediocre. First debuting in SamSho 3, Confusion is Basara's game plan. His erratic movements on many of his attacks can make it difficult to know what's the best approach option, and Basara is great at punishing bad guesses. Many of his attacks knock down, allowing him to loop favorable scenarios until the round's over. He has a plethora of good anti-air options that make jumping riskier against him. A teleport that has a similar animation to his tracking DP. He has shadow clones that match many of his normal movement options to make the opponent flinch. A perfect character for anyone that likes to stay unpredictable. But what happens when Basara is facing someone that won't fall for his tricks as easily? You now have a character forced to commit to very risky options that could lead to losing the round. Basara's neutral is pretty limited overall. His range on his 5C is pretty good, but it's slow in both startup and recovery, making it a prime target for getting deflected. The lack of recoil on many of his attacks also makes them much more punishable on block, with no way of canceling into another attack or deflect for a mix-up. Recoil cancels are a significant part of SamSho's RPS, making seemingly punishable attacks on paper become potentially round-ending mix-ups. Basara having a poor recoil game makes him both punishable and more predictable on block. He has some good pokes with 5B and 2B, but these are very low in damage. And what happens if you try to use these pokes while your opponent is in Rage Explosion? Since he can't recoil cancel, there's no way to prevent this from happening. When Basara gets a hit in, it does feel pretty good. But since he can't combo into any of his specials, he's forced to win many more interactions than the opponent in order to win the round. I alluded to it already, but while Basara's toolkit can feel overwhelming to anyone unfamiliar, an experienced player isn't going to fall for the illusion as easily. His shadow clones have obvious tells, like the camera not moving with them, and if you have blood on, the shadow clones will never have any blood on them, even if Basara does. Yes, if you happen to play with the blood off, you're actually giving Basara a slight buff. His tracking DP can be used to punish fireballs, but the slow startup at a whopping 27 frames makes this more difficult. Thank goodness he already has good anti-airs. His weapon flip can't be comboed into under normal circumstances, but it's also the only fully invincible weapon flip to compensate, so it's pretty good as a punish tool, right? Well, it does have its uses, like punishing careless fireballs, but the slow startup can mean your death if you mess up the timing. While Basra can be overwhelming to deal with when things go his way, the risk-reward for many of his moves is well in the opponent's favor. If you want to fundamentally diss on his character, there's a lot to like with Basra. Just be prepared to really work for your kills, and to avoid getting killed yourself. Debuting all the way back in the first game, Earthquake is a huge departure from what you'd expect from big body characters. He's a zoner that has fast, far-reaching buttons that can reach close to full screen. Special mention goes to his jumping C that reaches far, deals great damage for a normal, and provides Earthquake with great pressure. One of the best jumping normals in the game. Earthquake's punish tools are pretty solid too, with many far-reaching punishes and one of the best weapon flips in the game thanks to its range and startup. Earthquake isn't just a zoner though. He's also a ninja. As a ninja, Earthquake has access to a wall jump that provides him with extra mobility and a chance to bait out certain attacks. He has a teleport, although it works more as a punish tool rather than something he can run away with. He also has this strange drop-down air special that he can use to mess with his jump arc, almost like a dive kick. I think his advantages do put him above the previous characters I talked about, but he's still forced to work with a plethora of problems. The first problem is pretty obvious by looking at him.
He's fat!
Earthquake is massive, the largest character in the game, and with that comes the problem of being a very big target. He's going to be hit a lot due to his size, and there are many Earthquake-specific combos that work on him because of it. Earthquake is also a very slow character on the ground, slowest in the game as a matter of fact. Earthquake can't rely on running like other characters can, which makes his throw game a lot weaker compared to other characters. Run-throw is a very important part of SamSho 2019's neutral, and while not having a good run-throw game doesn't automatically make you a weaker character, it does put you at a significant disadvantage compared to the rest of the cast. Earthquake in general is a very weak character up close, with his close normals being slower than average and many of his specials being punishable up close. If he doesn't have weapon flip ready, Earthquake is going to spend more time trying to get back in mid to far range. While Earthquake can feel like an unbreakable wall when he's winning, he struggles hard to make a comeback due to how weak his approach options are. If the opponent has a good enough life lead, there's very little reason for them to get close to him. Even with how great and far-reaching his weapon flip is, it takes very strong fundamentals and patience to mount a comeback with Earthquake. Earthquake's design makes him a very unique character, not just in SamSho, but in the fighting game genre. But his design also makes him suffer from the major flaws both zoners and big bodies have to deal with. Also debuting in the first game, Wanfu is SamSho 2019's other big body, and he has a bit more of what you'd expect out of the archetype. But his main gimmick gives him a very unique twist that helps him stand out. As you'd expect from a guy carrying a giant pillar, Wanfu has some pretty great pokes, and very large jump normals too. His damage off pokes is pretty decent, although not as high as it could be since his far normals aren't cancelable. But he does have a pretty decent DP for anti-airs. All that aside, the main star of his kit is his pillar toss. Wanfu is able to throw down his pillar, disarming himself in the process. On hit, the damage is alright, but he gets enough time to pick up his weapon and reposition himself for more pillar toss shenanigans. On block, he is very plus, and has a solid enough mix-up game off it. He's even able to cross up with the pillar toss, creating an ambiguous left-right mix-up off it. Wanfu's air-to-air game is actually very strong thanks to pillar toss, and the threat of it is large enough that anti-airing him in general can be risky. While he does disarm himself to do this, he's given extra tools to work with while unarmed that make him much more threatening, including a command grab and a godlike unarmed heavy. I do think he's better than the other characters I've talked about here, but disarming yourself in SamSho is a pretty dangerous thing to do. Is all this really enough to make him a huge threat? The short answer is no. First off, Wanfu, for whatever reason, has a crouch walk like Kyoshiro does. Now, Wanfu isn't a zoner, so I don't think this cripples his game plan like it does Kyoshiro. He also has an easier time repositioning himself than Kyoshiro does, but the disadvantages of crouch walking still apply. Wanfu is never able to completely hold down a position, and crouch walking back too much can mean giving your opponent more ground and cornering yourself. When Wanfu's on the ground, he's going to want to stay at mid-range and use his pokes, but since his far pokes aren't cancelable, he actually has pretty low damage overall. Let's also look at his pillar toss. After all, it's the core of Wanfu's game plan. The pillar toss itself is an excellent move. Wanfu certainly has more than some characters when he's unarmed. He has a decent mix-up with his command grab and some good normals, but if the pillar toss mix fails, you're going to be feeling pretty desperate to get your weapon back. Gong Sun Li is another character that spends much of the match unarmed, and some characters keep important specials while unarmed too. So when you look at the bigger picture, unarmed Wanfu isn't as special as he seems. The threat of pillar toss is also much weaker in round 3. If you toss the pillar and the opponent bursts, Wanfu's now in the worst possible position you could be in the game. Being unarmed against an enraged opponent that also has the threat of Isen, the round is all but over at that point. The ideal play for Wanfu is to be at enough of an advantage that he forces the opponent to burst in round 2. Wanfu's game plan is surprisingly effective despite its problems, and I think it makes him particularly memorable compared to other fighting game big bodies. But while he isn't unplayable, the risks of his game plan become noticeable early on, and become a huge detriment in the final round. While there's always room for the meta to grow, the qualities that make a strong character in SamSho 2019 are pretty figured out at this point. And the characters we talked about today unfortunately just don't meet enough strong points to be called optimal. I may even do another video highlighting the game's top tiers in the future. At the end of the day, a character that clicks with you is going to take you further than just picking whoever's strong, no matter how flawed they may be. Even though we talked about the many problems these characters have, they're still very well-made, creative characters that add a lot to SamSho 2019's roster. Thank you to the knowledgeable players I reached out to, and the Mizuumi wiki for helping me gather the info used in this video. And thank you so much viewers for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.